de 2008, quando se completavam 60 anos da fundação do Estado de Israel, vários historiadores judeus contestaram em livros a narrativa oficial e heróica de uma terra sem povo para um povo sem terra. Ilan Pappé, da Universidade de Haifa, era um dos mais importantes entre esses revisionistas. Acabara de lançar o livro A Limpeza Étnica da Palestina, que se tornaria um best-seller, onde descreve em detalhes uma sistemática política de violência contra os árabes antes mesmo da oficialização do Estado de Israel pelas Nações Unidas. O repórter Cílio Bocaneira ouviu Ilan Pappé para o Milênio em Londres, onde ele lecionava na época. Uma entrevista que continua atual e ajuda a entender os acontecimentos na faixa de Gaza neste sombrio começo do ano de 2009.
Your research for the book indicated that there was a clear plan to clear Palestine of a large part of its Arab inhabitants in order to create a Jewish state before the state was actually created. How far back and who was doing this planning?
I think the idea to cleanse Palestine from its original indigenous population, from its local Arab population, emerged as a clear concept in the 1930s. And it was the brainchild of David Ben-Gurion, who became the first prime minister of Israel, and at the time the leader of the Jewish community in pre-1948 Palestine, that is pre-Israel Palestine. However, the idea of how to translate this wish, this strategy, into a proper plan developed only after the Second World War. In the first step, indeed, the first step was to have a register of all the Palestinian villages. A very amazing register. When I first saw it, I couldn't believe my eyes because it was so pedantic that it had, you could tell how many fruit trees each of the villages had and what kind of fruit these fruit trees grew. And of course the wealth of the villages, the quality of the land. This was a serious survey of, I would say, the future possession of the Jewish state.
As you indicated, the Arabs at this time were powerless because their leaders had been wiped out in the revolt of 1936. So the Jewish leadership targeted the British, I would imagine, after the Second World War.
Well, they targeted, yes, you're absolutely right. The reason they decided to fight the British is that, contrary to their expectation, Britain decided not to leave Palestine. And in fact was looking for a kind of a settlement that would involve Jews and Palestinians together under a British umbrella. And this is something that Zionist leaders didn't want to. And I think they analyzed correctly the weakness of post-World War II Britain. So they started a kind of a guerrilla war against the British, which didn't last for too long because the British were anyway, I think, on the way out. So it just helped, actually, the British decision makers to come to a final conclusion that they had enough of Palestine.
So they transferred the problem to the UN, and the UN, which was inclined in favor of Israel, decides on a partition plan. Israel went along with it, the Arabs did not.
That's
Why
right.
do you think they did not go along with it?
Well, from the Palestinian point of view, the Jewish colonizers were not different from the French colonizers of Algeria. And as it was unthinkable for people in Algeria to agree to the partitioning of Algeria between the French colonialists and the Algerian people, from the Palestinian perspective, that would amount to the same thing. But there are additional factors which can explain the Palestinian decision, although it may have been better maybe at the time to accept it as, at least as a tactic. But one can understand why. For instance, the Jews were only 1/3 of the population, and they were promised by the United Nations half of Palestine. The vast majority of the Jews were people who came 2 or 3 years ago, and they already were entitled to have half of the country. And above all, I think some of the United Nations people knew that what they were offering, which was a Jewish state which will have a large number of Palestinians, almost an equal number of Palestinians and Jews was something that the Zionist movement would not accept. And I think if you want, the ethnic cleansing tendencies of the Zionist movement were already known to some people in the Arab world, in the Palestinian camp, and definitely in the United Nations.
From that moment until the creation of the State of Israel in May of the following year, 1948, that was the key moment when the Jewish leadership got together and, according to your research, tried to attack the Arabs. How did they do that? What kind of a plan did they put together?
This is exactly the formative period, indeed. What they did, they were looking for, first of all, preparing the means for what they thought would be a struggle on two fronts. They thought that the Arab world would try, at least symbolically, if not even more seriously, to try and challenge the United Nations petition resolution by invading Palestine. So they needed a military that could confront regular Arab armies. The second front that they decided upon was the front of the part of Palestine that they wanted to become the Jewish state. They totally disregarded the United Nations petition map. And they decided actually to take the whole of Palestine, apart from what today is the West Bank, which they promised to King Abdullah of Jordan, the great-grandfather of the present King Abdullah of Jordan. And this was 80% of Palestine, in which you had 1 million Palestinians in it. And they looked, first of all, for the means of uprooting that 1 million Palestinians. Secondly, they were aware that people were still watching. British officials were still in Palestine until May 1948. There were already United Nations representatives on the ground, and the Western media was all still there in quite great numbers. People were interested, especially in America, in what was going on. So they didn't start it in one day. What they were looking for was the inevitable clashes and frictions that took place between the communities, the Palestinian and the Jewish communities, especially in the towns and the cities where people lived in proximity. So whenever you had such a big event like the United Nations Petition Resolution, people would shoot at each other and so on both sides. And they started to take each such action by the Palestinians as a pretext for first expelling one village, then expelling 2 villages, then 5 villages. And the pace was not very quickly until a very important date, the 10th of March 1948, when they felt that the British mandate is about to end, and they had not yet really depopulated Palestine. And that's when they decide to do it more systematically.
The official narrative of the state is that the Arabs decided to leave on their own.
That's right.
Partly because of Arab propaganda, radio transmissions. The neighboring Arab countries told them to go, and then 800,000 Arabs left on their own. That is not the way you see it.
No, that's a total fabrication. And I think today, among the professional historians in Israel, people would hesitate to repeat this fable. There is no proof for any such order on transmission, and we have good sources. The British recorded everything that went on the air ever since the 1930s in Palestine and in the Middle East as a whole. I know that the popular version in Israel is still the one you mentioned, that people voluntarily ran away, which, if you think about it linguistically, whether it's in Hebrew, in Portuguese, or in English, is a very bizarre term to say that people were running away voluntarily. I think only marathon runners voluntarily run. People who run away don't do it voluntarily. The picture which was vivid in my eyes, and I think in many ways predicated the whole book, was the stories I had on the villages on the coast of Palestine, later of Israel, which is very near to where I live in Israel. And these villages were people who, according to the United Nations petition resolution, were supposed to be citizens of the State of Israel, because they were part of the Jewish state, or the future Jewish state. And they resigned to the idea. They said the Ottomans ruled us, the Turks ruled us, the British ruled us. Now the Jews would rule us. I mean, they were simple peasants and farmers who said, okay, another new government, doesn't matter. And they just couldn't believe their eyes when the Israeli army came and gave them less than an hour to take what they can and just get out of their villages where they lived for hundreds of years, and shooting above their heads to accelerate their flight, and massacring anyone who resisted, and here and there raping women. For me, as I write in the book, I mean, as someone whose family survived the Nazi Holocaust, and many of my family did not survive the Nazi Holocaust, the idea that Jews could do such things 3 years after the Holocaust is still today something I cannot easily comprehend.
As you mentioned, one of the leading figures of this whole procedure, which, as the title of your book indicates, you call ethnic cleansing, was Ben-Gurion, the architect of ethnic cleansing. Is that the way you see it?
That's the way I see him. I think this is true about Zionism as a whole. My late friend Edward Said used to say, and I think that was typical to him, a very poignant way of looking at things. He said that Zionism, and this is true about David Ben-Gurion as well, was good for the Jews. Was good for the Jews. I mean, Zionism saved my family from Germany. So there was, and Zionism had a lot of achievements, and Ben-Gurion is responsible for many of them. But as far as the Palestinians are concerned, Zionism is the worst thing that could have ever happened to another people.
Another name that you bring out in not a very favorable light at that time, it's Yitzhak Rabin.
Absolutely.
What was he doing then?
Well, he was, of course, much younger than David Ben-Gurion. He was 40 years Ben-Gurion's junior. Ben-Gurion was in his early 60s, and Yitzhak Rabin was in his early 20s. He was responsible for one part of the ethnic cleansing, but a very horrid one. In the very center of Palestine, there were two Palestinian towns called Lida and Ramle, where about 100,000 lived altogether. And he was responsible for their uprooting in the summer of 1948. The summer in Palestine is very, very hot. And he and his colleagues forced them to march all the way to the West Bank, tens and tens of kilometers, where many people died on the way from thirst and hunger. A very inhuman aspect of the ethnic cleansing that altogether is, as I said before, a crime against humanity.
Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, were they involved in this phase as well, or only?
You know, that's the big Israeli, not the big, one of the Israeli propaganda successes. The worst crimes against the Palestinians were committed by the labor movement, the mainstream movement. And Shamir and Begin, I never admired, were never my idols, one has to say, did much less than the leaders of the labor movement. I mean, even when they were prime ministers, they did quite horrific things in the occupied territories. And Begin, of course, is responsible for the early destruction of Lebanon in 1982. It still pales in comparison to what the leaders of the labor movement did in 1948.
We move on to the 1950s. Did this ethnic cleansing continue in the early 1950s?
It continues until today. As we speak, ethnic cleansing continues in Jerusalem and elsewhere. And yes, in the 1950s it continued. Very interesting how Ben-Gurion is, again, responsible for this. The ethnic cleansing was not complete. It was quite an operation, and they had to leave at least 10% of the people they wished to ethnically cleanse. And that's how what we call today the Arab-Israeli minority came into being. But it was, for Ben-Gurion and his close aides, this was still a very high number. He wanted almost a clean Jewish state. So they tried in different means, because there was no war, and the world was a bit more sensitive than before, to force people to immigrate and to leave. And in some cases, in the cases of more than 30 villages, most of them, one should say, small villages, they continued the expulsion. I don't think there is a day in the history of post-1948 Palestine and Israel that the ethnic cleansing machine rests. It's all the time. It works all the time. There's a very interesting definition I bring in my book from the State Department, the American State Department website, where they say that every ethnic cleansing operation in history was followed by the erasure of people's history, not just was not just the uprooting of people, but also the erasure of their history. So you wipe out the people both from the history books and from the place itself. And Israel is no different. And there is, as I show in my book, there is in fact a very elaborate mechanism that includes the planting of forests, renaming Palestinian names with Hebrew names, that started in 1948 and continues now in the West Bank and the Greater Jerusalem area.
But then all of a sudden, a new leadership, new nationalist movements start to grow in the early 60s. You get the PLO, Fatah, Democratic Front, and groups like that. Do you see any parallels between what they started to do and what Irgun, Haganah, and Stern were doing?
In a way, I mean, there are some parallels. First of all, the methods, the actual guerrilla war. But I think there is a big, big difference between a group of modern-day colonialists, 20th century colonialists, who try, like the Pied Noir in Algeria, to not to allow a movement to a post-colonialist era and an anti-colonialist movement like the Palestinians. I don't think that's the main difference from my point of view. The PLO was and still is an anti-colonialist movement. I don't think the Irgun or the Haganah were an anti-colonialist movement. They were a bit like the whites in South Africa. They were trying to retain a reality that was acceptable in the 19th century maybe, but not anymore in the post-World War II ethical take on the world that developed, at least in the Western world.
In terms of methods, you see a parallel.
Methods, yes.
They were attacking civilians as well for political purposes.
Absolutely.
The basic definition of terrorism.
Yeah, and it's important to remind the Israelis of this when they talk about the Palestinians as terrorists, that they were also terrorists once.
Let's make a transition. You know, this whole concept of ethnic cleansing, getting rid of the Arabs, and the so-called demographic bomb that exists there. It used to be called a demographic problem, now it's a demographic danger, as it's pointing out, or a bomb. What is that bomb? What is that danger?
Oh, yes.
In the way they see it?
It's a very clear concept and a consensus concept among the leading Israeli politicians or the main members of the political elite. There is almost a quantitative way of telling when the Arabs become a danger. This is more or less between 20 to 25%. The reason I know the figure is because they keep mentioning it. The last
20-25%
of the overall of the overall population of Israel. Once you would decide what is the state of Israel, and if in that state there would be 25,000 non-Jews who have Israeli citizenship, and they will be Arabs, this is a key in the eyes of the political elite in Israel to the end of the state.
And of course, the fertility rate is much larger.
Much larger. This is going to happen anyway, even if they return half of the West Bank, even if they transfer small groups of people from Eastern Jerusalem. This is why I'm very, very worried, because I think there's no way of stopping it. I'm afraid that the Israelis think, and this is mainstream Israeli politicians think, that should this happen, one should say the Palestinians are now less than 20%, but should that happen, they are entitled to take any means in their disposal, including ethnic cleansing, to not to let this happen. And you ask every average Israeli on the street, and he will tell you, yes, this is the most important value above democracy, liberalism, human rights.
You think it's conceivable that Israel could give up on being just a Jewish state? It could be a state like any others, accommodating different faiths and just not being the so-called Jewish state, but a more open, democratic, normal state.
Yeah. Not in the short run. I mean, in the short run, I don't think this will happen. But I do think there is a good chance in the long run for two main reasons. One is, I think they're overdoing things now. I mean, in the past they had some sensibilities about not doing certain things, thinking that the world is watching, so on. And unfortunately, I think they're overdoing things. And I think they are testing the world's patience. Once the American global power would decrease, and it will decrease very soon, the world would be even bolder in trying to expose the more racist sides of the Jewish state. I think, in other words, my first point is that I predict a very strong, eventually external pressure on Israel. Not immediately, not immediately. The second thing, I think, are the realities on the ground. The Israelis cannot separate anymore the Jewish and Palestinian populations on the ground. They have built so heavily in the West Bank, and are still building so heavily on the West Bank, that actually the two communities are intertwined. Sometimes the reality can dictate to the political elite the program. Usually it's the other way around, but I think in this case you will find, and we already see signs for it, that even the most so-called racist, if you want, Israelis, begin to think that their children should learn Arabic, which they never wanted to do before, sort of realizing that they are more or less part of that reality. As even the most fanatic, if you want, Palestinians want their children to learn some Hebrew, despite of what they will say of, eliminating each other.
They're looking at a different reality in the future.
Looking at a different reality in the future.
A binational state.
A binational state, intertwined communities, not necessarily beginning with great love, not necessarily very happy about that reality, but coming more and more to the conclusion that anything else is what the Americans used to call is MAD, mutual assured destruction. So I think the processes on the ground and the world's impatience with the kind of trouble Israel is going to drag the world into, because we haven't seen the end of it, and I mean especially in the front against Iran and Syria, I think will eventually, but not immediately, create a chance for building a new reality in Palestine. Of course, there are other scenarios, unfortunately, more terrible one, like a total Israeli success of wiping out the Palestinians without the world
doing anything.
This is also, unfortunately, a possibility. But I hope that, I don't want to think about it in any way.
Yeah. Thank
you very much. Thank you.